Medicine often uses the training approach when trying to assess multipurpose talent. To ensure students can safely and effectively take care of patients, we have them jump through quite a few hoops, and they need good evaluations once they reach the clinic, passing grades on more exams like the USMLE. But GPT-4 gets more than 90% of questions on licensing exams correct. Does that provide any level of comfort in using GPT-4 in medicine? This is the AI Revolution in Medicine Revisited. I'm your host, Peter Lee. Shortly after OpenAI's GPT-4 was publicly released, Carrie Goldberg, Dr. Zach Kohani, and I published The AI Revolution in Medicine to help educate the world of healthcare and medical research about the transformative impact this new generative AI technology can have. But because we wrote the book when GPT-4 was still a secret, we had to speculate. Now, 2 years later, what did we get right and what did we get wrong? In this series, we'll talk to clinicians, patients, hospital administrators, and others to understand the reality of AI in the field and where we go from here. The book passage I read at the top is from Chapter 4, Trust But Verify. In it, we explore how AI systems like GPT-4 should be evaluated for performance, safety, and reliability, and compare this to how humans are both trained and assessed for readiness to deliver healthcare. In previous conversations with guests, we've spoken a lot about AI in the clinic, as well as in labs and companies developing AI-driven tools. We've also talked about AI in the hands of patients and consumers. But there has been some discussion also about AI's role in medical training. And as a founding board member of a new medical school at Kaiser Permanente, I definitely have my own thoughts about this. But today, I'm excited to welcome two guests who represent the next generation of medical professionals for their insights, Morgan Cheatham and Daniel Chen. Morgan Cheatham is a graduate of Brown University's Warren Alpert Medical School with clinical training in genetics at Harvard and is a clinical fellow at Boston Children's Hospital. While Morgan is a bona fide doctor in training, he's also, amazingly, an influential health technology strategist. He was recently named partner and head of healthcare and life sciences at Briar Capital and has led investments in several healthcare AI companies that have eclipsed multi-billion-dollar valuations. Daniel Chen is finishing his second year as a medical student at the Kaiser Permanente Bernard J. Tyson School of Medicine. He holds a neuroscience degree from the University of Washington and was a research assistant in the Raskin Lab at the UW School of Medicine, working with imaging and genetic data analyses for biomedical research. Prior to med school, Daniel pursued experiences that cultivated his interest in the application of AI in medical practice and education. Daniel and Morgan exemplify the real-world future of healthcare. A student entering his third year of medical school and a fresh medical school graduate who's starting a residency while at the same time continuing his work on investing in healthcare startups. Here's my interview with Morgan Cheatham. Morgan, thanks for joining. Really looking forward to this chat.
Peter, it's a privilege to be here with you. Thank you.
So, are there any other human beings who are partners at big league venture firms, residents at, a Harvard-affiliated medical center, author, editor for a leading medical journal? I mean, who's your cohort? Who are your peers?
I love this question. There are so many people who I consider peers that I look up to who have paved this path. And I think what is distinct about each of them is they have this physician plus orientation. They are multilingual in terms of knowing the language of medicine, but having learned other disciplines. And we share a common friend, Dr. Zach Kohani, who was among the first to really show how you can meld two worlds as a physician and make significant contributions to the intersections thereof. I also deeply, in the world of business, respect physicians like Dr. Krishna Yashwant at Google Ventures, who simultaneously pursued residency training and built what is now a large and enduring venture firm. So there are plenty of people out there who've carved their own path and become these multilingual beings. And I aspire to be one.
So, one thing I've been trying to explore with people are their origins with respect to the technology of AI. And there's two eras for that. There's AI before ChatGPT and before, generative AI really became a big thing, and then afterwards. So let's start first before ChatGPT. What was your contact? What was, your knowledge of AI and machine learning?
Sure. So my experiences in computer science date back to high school. I went to Thomas Jefferson, which is a high school in Alexandria, Virginia, that prides itself on requiring students to take computer science as in their first year of high school as kind of a required torturous experience. And I remember that fondly. Our final project was Brick Breaker. It was actually, I joke, all hard-coded, so there was nothing intelligent about the Brick Breaker that we had built. But that was my first exposure. I was a classics nerd, and I was really interested in biology and chemistry as a pre-medical student. So I really wouldn't intersect with this field again until I was shadowing at Inova Hospital, which was a local hospital near me. And it was interesting because at the time I was shadowing in the anesthesia department, they were actually implementing their first instance of Epic. And
Wow.
I remember that experience fondly because the entire hospital was going from analog, they were going from paper-based charts to this new digital system. And I didn't quite know in that moment what it would mean for the field or for my career, but I knew it was a big deal because a lot of people had a lot of emotion around what was going on.
Yeah.
And it was in that experience that I kind of decided to attach myself to the intersection of computational medicine. And so when I got to undergrad, I was a pre-medical student. I was very passionate about studying the sacred physician-patient relationship and everything that had to go on in that exam room to provide excellent care. But there were a few formative experiences. One working at a physician-founded startup that was using, at the time, we called it big data, if you remember, to match the right patient to the right provider at the right time. And it was in that moment that I realized that as a physician, I could utilize technology to scale that sacred one-to-one patient-provider interaction in nonlinear ways. So that was kind of the first experience where I saw deployed systems that were using patient data and clinical information in an intelligent format.
Yeah. And so you're a pre-medical student, but you have this computer science understanding. You have an intuition, I guess is the right way to say it, that the clinical data becoming digital is going to be important. So then what happens from there to your path to medical school?
Yeah, so I had a few formative research experiences in my undergraduate years. Nothing that ever amounted to a significant publication, but I was toying around with SVMs for sepsis and working with the Mimic database early days, and really just trying to understand what it meant that medical data was becoming digitized. And at the same time, again, I was rather unsatisfied doing that purely in an academic context. And I so early craved seeing how this would roll out in the wild, roll out in a clinical setting that I would soon occupy. And that was really what drove me to work at this company called Kairos and understand how these systems scaled. And obviously that's something with AI that we're now grappling with in a real way because it looks much different. So the other experience I had, which is less relevant to AI, but I did do a summer in banking. And I mention this because what I learned in the experience was it was a masterclass in business. And I learned that there was another scaling factor that I should appreciate as we think about medicine. And that was capital and business formation. And that was also something that could scale non-linearly. So when you married that with technology, it was kind of a natural segue for me before going to med school to think about venture capital and partnering with founders who are going to be building these technologies for the long term. And so that's how I landed on the venture side.
And then how long of a break before you started your medical studies?
It was about 4 years. Originally, it was going to be a 2-year deferral, and the pandemic happened. Our space became quite active in terms of new companies and investment. So it was about 4 years before I went back.
I see. And so you're in medical school. ChatGPT happened while you were in medical school. Is that right? That's right. Right before I was studying for step one. So the funny story, Peter, that I like to share with folks is
I was just embarking on designing my step one study plan with my mentor, and I went to NeurIPS for the first time, and that was in 2022 when, of course, ChatGPT was released. And for the remainder of that fall period, I should have been studying for these shelf exams and getting ready for this large board exam. And I was fortunate to partner actually with one of our portfolio company CEOs who is a physician. He is an MD, PhD, to work on the first paper that showed that ChatGPT could pass the US medical licensing exam. And that was a riveting experience for a number of reasons. I joke with folks that it was both the best paper I was ever a part of and proud to be a co-author of, but also the worst for a lot of reasons that we could talk about. It was the best in terms of canonical metrics like citations, but the worst in terms of, wow, did we spend 6 months as a field thinking this was the right benchmark for how to assess the performance of these models? And I'm so encouraged.
You shouldn't feel bad that way because, at that time I was secretly, assessing GPT, what we now know as GPT-4 in that period. And what was the first thing I tried to do? Step one, medical exam. By the way, just for our listeners who don't understand about medical education, in the US, there's a 3-part exam that extends over a couple of years of medical school. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. And Step 1 and Step 2 in particular are multiple choice exams. And they are very high stakes when you're in medical school. And you really have to have a command of quite a lot of clinical knowledge to pass these. And it's funny to hear you say what you were just sharing there, because it was also the first impulse I had with GPT-4. And in retrospect, I feel silly about that.
I think many of us do. But I've been encouraged over the last 2 years, to your point, that we really have moved our discourse beyond these exams to thinking about more robust systems for the evaluation of performance, which becomes even more interesting as you and I have spoken about these multi-agent frameworks that we are now, compelled to explore further.
Yeah. Even though I know you're a little sheepish about it now, I think in the show notes we'll link to that paper because it really was one of the seminal moments when we think about AI in medicine. And so you're seeing this new technology, and it's happening at a moment when you yourself have to confront taking the step one exam. So how did that feel?
It was humbling. It was shocking. What I had worked 2 years for, grueling over textbooks and, flashcards and all of the things we do as medical students, to see a system emerge out of thin air that was arguably going to perform far better than I ever would, no matter how much I was going to study for that exam. It set me back. It forced me to interrogate what my role in medicine would be. And it dramatically changed the specialties that I considered for myself long term. And I hope we talk about, how I stumbled upon genetics and why I'm so excited about that field and its evolution in this computational landscape. I had to do a lot of soul searching to relinquish what I thought it meant to be a physician and how I would adapt in this new environment.
One of the things that we wrote in our book, I think it was in a chapter that I contributed, I was imagining that students studying for step one would be able to do it more actively. Or you could even do sort of a pseudo step 3 exam by having a conversation. You provide the presentation of a patient and then have an encounter, where the ChatGPT is the patient, and then you pretend to be the doctor. And then in the example that we published, then you say end of encounter, and then you ask ChatGPT for an assessment of things. Maybe it all came too late for step one for you because you were already very focused and, had your own kind of study framework. But did you have an influence or use of this kind of technology for step 2 and step 3?
So even for step 1, I would say, it dropped in November. I took it in the spring. So I was able to use it to study. But the lesson I learned in that moment, Peter, was really about the importance of trust with AI and clinicians in training, because we all have the same resources that we use for these board exams, right? UWorld is this question bank. It's been around forever. If you're not using UWorld, like, good luck. And so why would you deviate off of a well-trodden path to study for this really important exam? And so I kind of adjunctively used GPT alongside UWorld to come up with more personalized explanations for concepts that I wasn't understanding. And I found that it was pretty good. And it was certainly helpful for me. Fortunately, I was, able to pass. But I was very intentional about dog fooding AI when I was a medical student. And part of that was because I had been a venture capitalist and I'd made investments in companies whose products I could actually use. And so, Abridge is a company in the scribing space that you and I have talked about.
Yeah.
I was so fortunate in the early days of their product to not just be a user, but to get to bring their product across the hospital. I could bring the product to the emergency department one week, to neurology another week, to the PICU, the next week, and assess the relative performance of, how it handled, really complex genetics cases versus these very challenging social situations that you often find yourself navigating in primary care. And so I not only was I emotional about this technology, but I was a voracious adopter in the moment.
Right. And you had a financial interest then on top of that, right?
I was not paid by Abridge to use the product, but I joke that the team was
you
probably
were
sick
working
of me.
you were working for a venture firm that was invested in these, right? So all of these things are wrapped up together. You're having to get licensed as a doctor while doing all of this. So I want to get into that investment and new venture stuff there, but let's stick just for a few more minutes on medical education. So I mentioned, what we wrote in the book, and I remember writing the example, of an encounter. Is that at all realistic? Is anything like that? That was pure speculation on our part. What's really happening? And then after we talk about what's really happening, what do you think should happen in medical education, given the reality of generative AI?
I've been pleasantly surprised talking with my colleagues about AI in clinical settings, how curious people are and how curious they've been over the last 2 years. I think oftentimes we say, this technology really is stratified by age, and the younger clinicians are using it more, and the older physicians are ignoring it. And, maybe that's true in some regards, but I've seen, many, senior attendings pulling up Perplexity, GPT, more recently Open Evidence, which has been a really essential tool for me personally at the point of care to come up with the best decisions for our patients. The general skepticism arises when people reflect on their own experience in training and they think, well, I had to learn how to do it this way.
Yeah.
And therefore, you using an AI scribe to document this encounter doesn't feel right to me because I didn't get to do that. And I did face some of those critiques or criticisms where you need to learn how to do it the old school way first, and then you can use an AI scribe. And I haven't yet seen, maybe even taking a step back, I haven't seen a lot of integration of AI into the core medical curriculum, period.
Yeah.
And as you know, if you want to add something to medical school curriculum, you can get in a long line of people who also want to do that. But it is urgent that our medical schools do create formalized required trainings for this technology because people are already using it.
Yeah.
I think what we will need to determine is how much of the old way do people need to learn in order to earn the right to use AI at the point of care, and how much of that old understanding, that prior experience, is essential to be able to assess the performance of these tools and whether or not they are having the intended outcome. I kind of joke, it's like learning cursive, right?
Yes.
Like, I'm old enough to have had to learn cursive. I don't think people really have to learn it these days.
Right.
When do I use it? Well, when I'm signing something. I don't even really sign checks
I've used,
anymore.
which you've heard is, I'm sure you were still taught the technique of manual palpation, even though you have access to technologies like ultrasound. And in fact, you would use ultrasound in many cases. And so I need to pin you down. What is your opinion on these things? Do you need to be trained in the old ways?
When it comes to understanding the architecture of the medical note, I believe it is important for clinicians in training to know how that information is generated, how it's characterized, and how to go from a very broad reaching conversation to a distilled clinical document that serves many functions. Does that mean that you should be forced to practice without an AI scribe for the entirety of your medical education? No. And I think that as you are learning the architecture of that document, you should be handed an AI scribe, and you should be empowered to have visits with patients, both in an analog setting where you are transcribing and generating that note, and soon thereafter, I'm talking in a matter of weeks, working with an AI scribe.
Yeah.
That's my personal belief.
Yeah. So you're going to, well, first off, congratulations on landing a residency at Boston Children's.
Thank you, Peter.
I understand there were only 2 people selected for this, and super competitive. With that perspective, how do you see your future in medicine, just given everything that's happening with AI right now? And are there things that you would urge, let's say, the dean of the Brown Medical School to consider or to change in that, or maybe not the dean of Brown, but the head of the LCME, the accrediting body for U.S. medical schools? What in your mind needs to change?
Sure. I'll answer your first question first and then talk about the future.
Yeah.
For me personally, I fell into the field of genomics. And so my training program will cover both pediatrics as well as clinical genetics and genomics. And I alluded to this earlier, but one of the reasons I'm so excited to join the field is because I really feel like the field of genetics not only is focused on a very underserved patient population, but not in how we typically think of underserved. I'm talking about underserved as in patients who don't always have answers, patients for whom the current guidelines don't offer information or comfort or support. Those are patients that are extremely underserved. And I think in this moment of AI, there's a unique opportunity to utilize the computational systems that we now have access to provide these answers more precisely, more quickly.
Yep.
And so I'm excited to marry those two fields. And genetics has long been a field that has adopted technology. If we just think about the foundational technology of genomic sequencing and variant interpretation. And so it's a kind of natural evolution of the field,
Yep.
I believe, to integrate AI and specifically generative AI. If I were speaking directly to the LCME, I mean, I would just have to encourage the organization, as well as medical societies who partner with attending physicians across specialties, to lean in here. When I think about prior revolutions in technology and medicine, physicians were not always at the helm. We have a unique opportunity now, and you talk about companies like Abridge in the AI space, companies like Viz.ai, Clearly. I mean, I could go on, Iterative Health. I could list 20 organizations that are bringing AI to the point of care that are founded by physicians. Yep. This is our moment to have a seat at the table and to shape not only the discourse, but the deployment. And the unique lens, of course, that a physician brings is that of prioritizing the patient. And with AI and this time around, we have to do that.
So LCMA, for our listeners, is, I think it stands for the Liaison Committee on Medical Education. It's basically the accrediting body for U.S. medical schools, and it's very high stakes. It's very, very rigorous, which I think is a good thing. But it's also a bit of a straitjacket. So if you are on the LCME, are there specific new curricular elements that you would demand that LCMA, add to its accreditation standards?
We need to unbundle the different components of the medical appointment and think about the different functions of a human clinician to answer that question. There are a couple of areas that are top of mind for me, the first being medical search. There are large organizations in healthcare, incumbents that have been around for many decades, companies like UpToDate, or even the guidelines that are housed by our medical societies that need to respond to the information demands of clinicians at the point of care in a new way with AI. And so I would love to see our medical institutions teaching more students how to use AI for medical search problems at the point of care, how to not only from a prompt perspective, ask questions about patients in a high efficacy way, but also to interpret the outputs of these systems to inform downstream clinical decision making. People are already adopting, as you know, GPT, open evidence, Perplexity, all of these tools to make these decisions now.
Yes.
And so by not, again, it's a moral imperative of the LCME, by not having curriculum and support for clinicians doing that, we run the risk of folks not utilizing these tools properly, but also to their greatest potential.
Yeah. And then, but zooming forward, then what about board certification?
Board certification today is already transitioning to an open book format for many specialties, is my understanding.
Yeah.
And in talking to some of my fellow geneticists who, that's a pretty challenging board exam in clinical genetics or biochemical genetics. They are using open evidence during those open book exams. So what I would like to see us do is move from a system of rote memorization and regurgitation of fact to an assessment framework that is adaptive, is responsive, and assesses for your ability to use the tools that we now have at our disposal to make sound clinical decisions.
Yeah. We've heard from Sarah Murray, that when she's doing her rounds, she consults routinely with ChatGPT. And that was something we also predicted, especially Carrie Goldberg in our book, wrote this fictional account. Is that the primary real world use of AI, not only by clinicians, but also by medical students? Are medical students, engaged with ChatGPT or, similar?
Absolutely. I've listed some of the tools. I think there, in general, Peter, is this new clinician stack that is emerging of these tools that people are trying. And I think the cycles of iteration are quick, right? Some folks are using, Claude 1 week and they're trying Perplexity, or they're trying open evidence, they're trying GPT for a different task. There's this kind of moment in medicine that every clinician experiences where you're on rounds and there's that very senior attending and you've just presented a patient to them and you think you did an elegant job and you've summarized all the information and you really feel good about your differential, and they ask you the one question you didn't think to address. And I'll tell you, some of the funniest moments I've had using AI in the hospital has been, and let me take a step back, that process of a attending physician interrogating a medical student is called pimping, for lack of a better phrase. And some of the funniest use cases I've had for AI in that setting is actually using open evidence or GPT to as defense against pimping. So quickly, while they're asking me the question, I put it in, and I'm actually able to answer it right away. So it's been effective for that. But I would say, the halls of most of the hospitals where I've trained, I'm seeing this technology in the wild.
So now you're so tech forward, but that off-label use of AI, we also, when we wrote our book, we weren't sure that at least top health systems would tolerate this. Do you have an opinion about this? Should these things be better regulated or controlled by the CIOs of Boston Children's?
I'm a big believer that transparency encourages good behaviors. And so the first time I actually tried to use ChatGPT in a clinical setting, it was at a hospital in Rhode Island. I will not name which hospital, but the site was actually blocked. I wasn't able to access it from a desktop. That was the hospital's first response to this technology was, let's make sure none of our clinicians can access it. It has so much potential for medicine. The irony of that today. And it's since, become unblocked. But I was able to use it on my phone. So to your point, if there's a will, there's a way. And we will utilize this technology if we are seeing perceived value.
So, absolutely. So now, in some discussions, one superpower that seems to be common across people who are really leading the charge here is they seem to be very good readers and students. And I understand you also as a voracious reader. In fact, you're even on an editorial team for a major medical journal. To what extent does that help? And then from your vantage point at New England Journal of Medicine AI, and I'll have a chance to ask Zach Kohani, as the editor-in-chief, the same question. What's your assessment as you reflect over the last 2 years for the submitted manuscripts? Are you overall surprised at what you're seeing, disappointed, any kind of notable hits or misses? Just in the steady stream of research papers that are getting submitted to that leading journal?
I would say overall, the field is becoming more expansive in the kinds of questions that people are asking. Again, when we started, it was this very myopic approach of, can we pass these medical licensing exams? Can we benchmark this technology to how we benchmark our human clinicians? I think it's a trap. Some folks call this the Turing trap, right? Of let's just compare everything to what a human is capable of, instead of interrogating what is the unique, as you all talk about in the book, what are the unique attributes of this new substrate for computation, and what new behaviors emerge from it, whether that's from a workflow perspective in the back office, or, as I'm personally more passionate, and as we're seeing more people focus on in the literature, what are the diagnostic capabilities, right? I love Eric Topol's framework for machine eyes, right? As this notion of like, yes, we as human have eyes, and we have looked at medical images for many, many decades, but these machines can take a different approach to a retinal image, right? It's not just what you can diagnose in terms of an ophthalmological disease, but maybe a neurologic disease, or maybe liver disease, right? So I think the literature is in general moving to this place of expansion, and I'm excited by that.
Yeah, that I kind of have referred to that as triangulation. One of the things, I think, a trap that specialists in medicine can fall into, like a cardiologist, will see everything in terms of the cardiac system, and whereas a nephrologist will see things in a certain lens. And one of the things that you oftentimes see in the responses from a large language model is that more expansive view. At the same time, I wonder, we have medical specialties for a good reason, and at times I do wonder, if there can be confusion that builds up.
This is an under-discussed area of AI.
Yeah.
AI collapses medical specialties onto themselves, right?
Yep.
You have the canonical example of the cardiologist, arguing that, we should diurese, and maybe the nephrologist arguing that we should, protect the kidneys. Right. And how do two disciplines disagree on what is right for the patient when, in theory, there is an objective best answer given that patient's clinical status? My understanding is that the emergence of medical specialties was a function of the cognitive overload of medicine in general, and how difficult it was to keep all of the specifics of a given specialty in the mind. Of course, general practitioners are tasked with doing this at some level, but they're also tasked with knowing when they've reached their limit and when they need to refer to a specialist. So I'm interested in this question of whether medical specialties themselves need to evolve. And if we look back in the history of medical technology, there are many times where a new technology forced a medical specialty to evolve, whether it was certain diagnostic tools that have been introduced, or as we're seeing now with GLP-1s, the entire cardiometabolic field is having to really reimagine itself with these new tools. So I think AI will look very similar, and we should not hold on to this notion of classical medical specialties simply out of convention.
Right. All right. So now you're starting your residency. You're basically leading a charge in health and life sciences for a leading venture firm. I'd like you to predict what the world of healthcare is going to look like, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and to frame that, to make it a little more specific. What do you think will be possible that you, as a doctor and an investor, will be able to do 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that you can't do today?
2 years from now, I'm optimistic we'll have greater adoption of AI by clinicians, both for back office use cases. So whether that's the scribe and the generation of the note for billing purposes, but also now thinking about that for patient-facing applications. We're already doing this with drafting of notes. I think we'll see greater proliferation of those more obvious use cases over the next 2 years. And hopefully we're seeing that across hospital systems, not just large, well-funded academics, but really reaching our community hospitals, our rural hospitals, our under-resourced settings. I think hopefully we'll see greater conversion. Right now we have this challenge of pilotitis, right? A lot of people are trying things, but the data shows that only 1 in 3 pilots are really converting to production use. So hopefully we'll kind of move things forward that are working and pare back on those that are not. We will not solve the problem of payment models in the next 2 years. That is a prediction I have. Over the next 5 years, I suspect that with the help of regulators, we will identify better payment mechanisms to support the adoption of AI, because it cannot and will not sustain itself simply by asking health systems and hospitals to pay for it.
Yes.
That is not a scalable
Right.
solution.
Yep. In fact, I think there have to be new revenue positive incentives if providers are asked to do more in the adoption of technology.
Absolutely. But as we appreciate, some of the most promising applications of AI have nothing to do with revenue and might simply be providing a diagnosis to somebody, for whom that might drive additional intervention, but may also not. And we have to be okay with that, because that's the right thing to do. It's our moral imperative as clinicians to implement this where it provides value to the patient. Over the next 10 years, what I, again, being a techno-optimist, am hopeful we start to see is a dissolving of the barrier that exists between care delivery and biomedical discovery. This is the vision of the learning health system that was written over 10 years ago.
Yes.
And we have not realized it in practice. I'm a big proponent of ensuring that every single patient that enters our healthcare system not only receives the best care, but that we learn from the experiences of that individual to help the next. And in our current system, that is not how it works. But with AI, that now becomes possible.
Well, I think connecting healthcare experiences to medical discovery, I think that is really such a great vision for the future. And I do agree, AI really gives us real hope that we can make it true. Morgan, I think we could talk for a few hours more. It's just incredible what you're up to nowadays. Thank you so much for this conversation. I've learned a lot talking to you.
Peter, thank you so much for your time. I will be clutching my signed copy of The AI Revolution in Medicine for many years to come.
Morgan obviously is not an ordinary med school graduate. In previous episodes, one of the things we've seen is that people on the leading edge of real-world AI in medicine oftentimes are both practicing doctors as well as technology developers. Morgan is another example of this type of polymath, being both a med student and a venture capitalist. One thing that struck me about Morgan is he's just incredibly hands-on. He goes out, finds leading-edge tools and technologies, and often these things, even though they're experimental, he takes them into his education and into his clinical experiences. I think this highlights a potentially important point for medical schools, and that is it might be incredibly important to provide the support and, let's be serious, the permission to students to access and use new tools and technologies. Indeed, the insight for me when I interact with Morgan is that in these early days of AI in medicine, there is no substitute for hands-on experimentation, and that is likely best done while in medical school. Here's my interview with Daniel Chen. Daniel, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure being here.
Well, I normally get started in these conversations by asking, how do you explain to your mother what you do all day? And the reason that that's a good question is a lot of the people we have on this podcast have fancy titles and unusual jobs. But I'm guessing that your mother would have already a preconceived notion of what a medical student does. So I'd like to twist the question around a little bit for you and ask, what does your mother not realize about how you spend your days at school? Or does she get it all right?
No, she is very observant. I'll say that off the bat. But I think something that she might not realize is the amount of efforts spent kind of outside the classroom or outside the hospital. She's always like saying, "Oh, you have such long days in the hospital. You're there so early in the morning." But what she doesn't realize is that maybe when I come back from the hospital, it's not just like, "Oh, I'm done for the day. Let's wind down, go to bed." But it's more like, okay, I have some more practice questions I need to get through. I didn't get through my studying. Let me wrap up this research project I'm working on, get that back to the PI. It's never ending to a certain extent.
Right.
That those are some things she doesn't realize.
Yeah, I think, all the time studying, I think, is something that people expect of second year medical students. And even nowadays at the top medical schools, like this one, being involved in research is also expected. I think one thing that is a little unusual is that you are actually in clinic as well as a second year student. How has that gone for you?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely interesting. I would say I spend my time, especially this year, it's kind of three things. There's the preclinical stuff I'm doing, so that's your
Right.
classic, you're learning from the books. Though I don't feel like many of us do have textbooks anymore. There's the clinical aspect, which you mentioned, which is we have an interesting model, longitudinal integrated clerkships. We can talk about that. And the last component's the research aspect, right? The extracurriculars. Um, but I think starting out as a second year and doing your rotations pretty early on in kind of the medical education has been really interesting, especially with our format. Because typically med students have 2 years to read up on all the material and like get some foundational knowledge. With us, it's a bit more. We have maybe 1 year under our belt before we're thrown into like, okay, go talk to this patient. They have ankle pain, right? But we might have not even started talking about ankle pain in class, right? Well, where do I begin? So I think starting out, it's kind of like the classic drinking from a fire hydrant, but you also kind of have that embarrassment of you're talking to the patient like I have no clue what's happening, or you might have my differentials all over the place, right? But I think the beauty of the longitudinal aspect is that now that we're like in our last trimester, everything's kind of coming together. Like, okay, I can start to see, here's what you're telling me, here's what the physical exam findings are. I'm starting to form a differential. Like, okay, I think these are the top three things. But in addition to that, I think these are the next steps you should take so we can really focus and hone in on what exact diagnosis this might be.
All right. So, of course, what we're trying to get into is about AI. And, the funny thing about AI and the book that Carrie, Zach, and I wrote is we actually didn't think too much about medical education, although we did have some parts of our book where first off, we made the guess that medical students would find AI to be useful. And we even had some examples, where, you would have a vignette of a mythical patient and you would ask the AI to pretend to be that patient. And then you would have an interaction and have to have an encounter. And so I want to delve into whether any of that is happening, how real it is. But before we do that, let's get into, first off, your own personal contact with AI. So let me start with a very simple question. Do you ever use generative AI systems like ChatGPT or similar?
All the time, if not every day.
Every day. Okay. And when did that start?
I think when it first launched with GPT 3.5, I was, curious. All my friends work in tech. They're either software engineers, PMs. They're like, "Hey, Daniel, take a look at this." And at first, I thought it was just more of a glorified search engine. I think I was actually looking back. My first question to ChatGPT was, "What was the weather going to be like the next week?" Something very like something easily you could have looked up on Google or your phone app, right?
Right.
And I'm like, "Oh, this is pretty cool." But then kind of fast forwarding to I think the first instance I was using it in med school. I think the first like thing that really helped me was actually a coding problem. It was for a research project. I was trying to use SQL. Obviously, I've never taken a SQL class in my life. So I asked Chat, like, hey, can you write me this code to maybe morph two columns together, right? Something that might have taken me hours to maybe Google on YouTube or like try to read some documentation which goes through my head. But ChatGPT was able to, not only produce the code, but like walk me through like, okay, you're going to launch SQL. You're going to click on this menu, put the code in here, make sure your file names are correct. And it worked. So it's been a very powerful tool in that way in terms of like giving me expertise in something that maybe I traditionally had no training in.
And so while you're doing this, I assume you had fellow students, friends, and others. And so what were you observing about their contact with AI? I assume you weren't alone in this.
Yeah. I think I'm not too sure in terms of what they were doing when it first came out, but I think if we were talking about present day, a lot of it's kind of really spot on to what you guys talked about in the book. I think the idea around this personal tutor, personal mentor, is something that we're seeing a lot. Even if we're having in-class discussions, the lecturer might be saying something, right? And then I might be, or I see a friend in ChatGPT or some other model looking up a question. And then you guys talk about, how it can like explain a concept at different levels, right? But honestly, sometimes if there's a complex topic, I ask ChatGPT, like, can you explain to me as if I was a 6-year-old,
Yeah.
breaking down complex topics. Yeah. So I think it's something that we see in the preclinical space in lecture, but also even in the clinical space, there's a lot of teaching as well. Sometimes if my preceptor is busy with the patients, but I had maybe a question, I would maybe converse with ChatGPT, like, hey, what are your thoughts about this? Or like a common one is like medical doctors love to use abbreviations, and these abbreviations are sometimes only very niche and unique to their specialty, right? And I was reading this note from a urogynecologist, and the entire first sentence, I think there were like 10 abbreviations. Obviously, I compile lists and ask ChatGPT, like, hey, in the context of urogynecology, can you define what these could possibly mean, right? Instead of hopelessly searching in a Google or maybe embarrassingly asking the preceptor. So in these instances, it's played a huge role.
Yeah. And when you're doing things like that, it can make mistakes. And so what are your views of the reliability of generative AI, at least in the form of ChatGPT?
Yeah, I think into the context of medicine, right? It's we fear a lot about the hallucinations that these models might have, and it's something I'm always checking for when I talk with peers about this. We find it most helpful when the model gives us a source, linking it back. I think the gold standard nowadays in medicine is using something called UpToDate that's written by clinicians for clinicians. But sometimes searching on UpToDate can be a lot of time as well, because it's a lot of information to like sort through. But nowadays, a lot of us are using something called open evidence, which is also an LLM, but they always cites their citations with like published literature, right? So I think being able to be conscious of the downfalls of these models, and also being able to have the critical understanding of like analyzing the actual literature, I think double checking is something that we've been also getting really good at.
How would you assess student attitudes, med student attitudes about AI? Is it the way you're coming across is it's just a natural part of life, but do people have firm opinions, pro or con, when it comes to AI, and especially AI in medicine?
I think it's pretty split right now. I think there's the half kind of like us, where we're very optimistic, cautiously optimistic about the potential of this, right? It's able to give us that extra information, being that extra tutor, right? It's also able to give us information very quickly as well. But I think the other flip side of what a lot of students hesitate to, which I agree, is this loss of the ability to critically think. Something that you can easily do is, give these models like relevant information about the patient history and be like, give me a 10 list differential, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's very easy as a student to, this is difficult, let me just use what the model says and we'll go with that, right?
Yeah.
So I think being able to separate that, medical school is a time where, you're learning to become a good doctor. And part of that requires the ability to be observant and critically think. Having these models simultaneously might hinder the ability to do that. So I think, the next step is like, these models can be great, a great tool, absolutely wonderful. But how do you make sure that it's not hindering these abilities to critically think?
Right. And so when you're doing your LIC work, these longitudinal experiences, and you're in clinic, are you pulling the phone out of your pocket and consulting with AI?
Definitely. And I think
Yeah.
my own policy for this to kind of counter this is that the night before, when I'm looking over the patient list, the clinic of who's coming, I'm always giving it my best effort first. Like, okay, the chief complaint is maybe just a runny nose for a kid in a pediatric clinic. What could this possibly be, right? At this point, we've seen a lot. Like, okay, it could be URI, it could be viral, it could be bacterial, and then I go through I try to do my due diligence of like going through the history and everything like that, right? But sometimes if it's a more complex case, something maybe a presentation I've never seen before, I'll still kind of do my best coming up with maybe a differential. Might not be amazing, but then I'll ask, ChatGPT like, okay, in addition to these ideas, what do you
Yeah.
think? Am I missing something? And
Right.
usually it gives a pretty good response.
That particular idea is something that I think Carrie, Zach, and I thought would be happening a lot more today than we're observing. And it's the idea of a second set of eyes on your work. And somehow, at least our observation is that that isn't happening quite as much by today as we thought it might. And it just seems like one of the really safest and most effective use cases. When you go and you're looking at yourself and other fellow medical students, other second year students, what do you see when it comes to this second set of second set of eyes idea?
I think like a lot of students are definitely consulting ChatGPT in that regard because, you know, even in the very beginning, we're taught to be like, never miss these red flags, right? So these red flags are always on our differential, but sometimes it can be difficult to figure out where to place them on that, right? So I think in addition to, coming up with these differentials, something I've been finding a lot of value is just chatting with these tools to get their rationale behind their thinking. Something I find really helpful. I think this is also part of the kind of art of medicine is figuring out what to order, right? What labs to order.
Right.
Obviously, you have your order sets that automate some of the things like in the ED, or like there are some gold standard imaging things you should do for certain presentations. But then you chat to like 10 different physicians on maybe the next steps after that, and they give you 10 different answers.
Yes.
But I never understand exactly why. It's always like, I've just been doing this for all my training, or that's how I was taught. So
Yeah.
asking ChatGPT, like, why would you do this next? Or like, is this a good idea? And seeing the pros and cons has also been really helpful in my learning.
Yeah. Wow. That's super interesting. So now, I'd like to get into the education you're receiving, and I think it's fair to say Kaiser Permanente is very progressive and really trying to be very cutting edge in how the whole curriculum is set up. And for the listeners who don't know this, I'm actually on the board of directors of the school and have been since the founding of the school. And I think one of the reasons why I was invited to be on the board is the school really wanted to think ahead and be cutting edge when it comes to technology. So from where I've sat, I've never been completely satisfied with the amount of tech that has made it into the curriculum. But at the same time, I've also made myself feel better about that, just understanding that it's sort of unstoppable, that students are so tech forward already. But I wanted to delve in a little bit here into what your honest opinions are and your fellow students' opinions are about whether you feel like you're getting adequate training and background formally as part of your medical education when it comes to things like artificial intelligence or other technologies. What do you think? Are you would you wish the curriculum would change?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think from a tech perspective, the school is very good about implementing, opportunities for us to learn. Um, like for example, learning how to use Epic, right? Or at Kaiser Permanente, they
Right.
call it Health Connect, right? These
Yep.
electronic health records. That my understanding is that a lot of schools maybe don't teach that. That's something where we get training sessions maybe once or twice a year. Like, hey, here's how to make a shortcut in the environment, right? So I think from that perspective, the school is really proactive in providing those opportunities, and they make it very easy to find resources for that too.
Yeah, I think you're pretty much guaranteed to be an epic black belt by the time you finish
Yes,
your degree.
yes. But then I think in terms of the aspects of artificial intelligence, I think the school's taken a more cautiously optimistic viewpoint. They're just kind of looking around right now. Formally in the curriculum, there hasn't been anything around this topic. I believe the fourth year students last year got a student-led lecture around this topic. But talking to other peers at other institutions, it looks like it's something that's very slowly being built into the curriculum, and it seems like a lot of it is actually student-led. You know, my friend at Feinberg, it was like we just got a session before clerkship about best practices on how to use these tools. I have another friend at Pitt talking about how they're leading efforts of maybe incorporating some sort of LLM into their in-house curriculum, where students can, instead of clicking around the website trying to find the exact slide, they can just ask this tool like, okay, we had class this day, they talked about this, but can you provide more information? And it can pull from that. So I think a lot of it is student driven, which I think is really exciting, because it begs the question, I think, current physicians maybe not be very well equipped with these tools as well, right? So maybe they don't have a good idea of what exactly is the next steps, or what does the curriculum look like. So I think the future in terms of this AI curriculum is really student-led as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think one of the reasons I think also that happens is it's not just necessarily the curriculum that lags, but the accreditation standards. Accreditation is really important for medical schools, because you want to make sure that anyone who holds an MD, is a bona fide doctor. And so accreditation standards are pretty strictly monitored in most countries, including the United States. And I think accreditation standards are also, my observation, are slow to understand how to adopt or integrate AI. And it's not meant as a criticism. It's a big unknown. No one knows exactly what to do and how to do. And so it's really interesting to see that, as far as I can tell, I've observed the same thing that you just have seen, that most of the innovation in this area about how AI should be integrated into medical education is coming from the students themselves. It seems, I'd like to think it's a healthy development.
Something tells me maybe the students are a bit better at using these tools as well. I talked to my preceptors, because KP also has their own version.
A preceptor, maybe we should explain.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
What that is.
So a preceptor is an attending physician, fully licensed, finished residency, and they are essentially your kind of teacher in the clinical environment.
Right.
So KP has their own version of some ambient documentation device as well. And something I always like to ask, like, hey, what are your thoughts on these tools, right? And it's always so polarizing as well, even among the same specialty. Like if you ask psychiatrists, which I think is a great use case of these tools, right? My preceptor hates it. Another preceptor next door loves it. So I think a lot of it is still like a lot of unknowns, like you were mentioning.
Right. Well, in fact, I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing that we've been hearing from previous guests a lot when it comes to AI in clinic is about ambient listening by AI, for example, to help set up a clinical note or even write a clinical note. And another big use case that we heard a lot about that seems to be pretty popular is the use of generative AI to respond to patient messages. So let's start with the clinical note thing. First off, do you have opinions about that technology?
I think it's definitely good. I think especially where, if you're in the family medicine environment or pediatric environment where you're spending so much time with patients, a note like that is great, right? I think coming from a strictly medical student standpoint, I think it honestly, it'd be great to have, but I think there's a lot of learning when you write the note. There's a lot of, all my preceptors talk about, like, when I read your note, it should present it in a way where I can see your thoughts. And then once I get to the assessment and plan, it's kind of funneling down towards a single diagnosis or a handful of
Right.
diagnosis. And that's, I think, a skill that requires you to practice over time, right?
Yes.
So a part of me thinks, like, if I had this tool where I can just automatically give me a note as a first year, then it takes away from that learning experience. Even during our first year throughout school, we frequently get feedback from professors and doctors about these notes. And it's a lot of feedback. It's like, I don't think you should have written that. That should be in this section, like a medical note or a SOAP note where, the
Yep.
subjective is like what the patient tells you, objective is what the physical findings are, and then your assessment of what's happening, and then your plan. Like, it's very particular. And then I think medicine is so structured in a way that's kind of like how everyone does it, right? So kind of going back to the question, I think it's a great tool, but I don't think it's appropriate for a medical student.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you say that. I was one of our previous guests is the head of R&D at Epic, Seth Hain. He said, Peter, doctors do a lot of their thinking when they write the note, and of course, Epic is providing ambient, clinical, note-taking automation, but he was urging caution because, you're saying, well, this is where you're learning a lot, but actually it's also a point where, as a doctor, you're thinking about the patient, and we do probably have to be careful with how we automate parts of that. All right, so you're gearing up for step 1 of the USMLE. That'll be a big multiple choice exam, and then step 2 is similar, very, very focused on advanced clinical knowledge. And then step 3, is a little more interactive. And so one question that people have had about AI is, how do we regulate the use of AI in medicine? And one of the famous papers that came out of both academia and industry was the concept that you might be able to treat AI like a person and have it go through the same licensing. And this is something that Carrie, Zach, and I contemplated in our book. In the end, at the time we wrote the book, I personally rejected the idea, but I think it's still alive. And so I've wondered if you have first off, are you opinionated at all about what should the requirements be for the allowable use of AI in the kind of work that you're going to be doing?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question because, like, where do you draw that line, right? If you apply the human standards of it's passing exams, then yes, in theory, it could be maybe a medical doctor as well, right? It's more empathetic than medical doctors, right? So where do you draw that line? I think, part of me thinks it's maybe it is that human aspect that patients like to connect with, right? And maybe this really is just like these tools are just aids in helping, maybe load off some cognitive load, right? But I think the other part of me I'm thinking about this is the next generation who are growing up with this technology, right? They're interacting with applications all day. Maybe they're on their iPads, they're talking to chatbots, they're using ChatGPT. This is kind of the environment they grew up with. Does that mean they also have increased trust in these tools that maybe our generation or the generations above us don't have, that value that human connection? Would they value human connection less? I think those are some troubling thoughts that, yes, at the end of the day, maybe I'm not as smart as these tools, but I can still provide that human comfort. But if at the end of the day, the future generation doesn't really care about that, or they perfectly trust these tools because that's all they've kind of known, then where do human doctors stand? I think part of that is there would be certain specialties where maybe the human connection is more important. The longitudinal aspect of building that trust, I think, is important. Family medicine is a great example. I think hematology, oncology with cancer treatment. Obviously, I think anyone's not going to be thrilled to hear a cancer diagnosis, but something tells me that seeing that on a screen versus maybe a physician prompting you and telling you about that tells me that maybe in those aspects, the human nature, the human touch plays an important role there too.
Yeah. I think it strikes me that it's going to be your generation that really is going to set the pattern, probably for the next 50 years, about how this goes. And it's just so interesting because I think a lot will depend on your reactions to things. So, for example, one thing that is already starting to happen are patients who are coming in armed, with a differential. That they've developed themselves with the help of ChatGPT. So let me. You must have thought about these things. So, in fact, has it happened in your clinical work already?
Yeah, I've seen people come into the ED during my ED shift, like emergency
Yeah.
department,
Yeah.
and they'll be like, "Oh, I'm not like I have neck pain, and here are all the things that ChatGPT told me. What do you think? Do I need? I want this lab ordered, that lab ordered."
Right.
And I think my initial reaction is, "Great, that maybe we should do that." But I think the other reaction is understanding, is that not everyone has the clinical background of understanding what's most important, what do we need to absolutely rule out, right? So I think in some regards, I would think that maybe ChatGPT errs on the side of caution, giving maybe
Yes.
patients more extreme examples of what this could be, just to make sure that it's in a way is not missing any red flags as well, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I think a lot of this is what we've been learning is it's all about shared decision making with the patient, right? Being able to acknowledge, like, yeah, that list, most of the stuff is very plausible, but maybe you didn't think about this one symptom you have.
Yeah.
So I think part of it, maybe it's a sidebar here, is the idea of prompting, right? They always talked about all these, prompt engineers. How well can you like give it context to answer your question? So
Yeah.
I think being able to give these models the correct information and the relevant information, and keyword relevant, because relevant is I guess where your clinical expertise comes in. Like, what do you give the model? What do you not give? So I think that difference between a medical provider versus maybe a patient is ultimately the difference.
Let me press on that a little bit more because you brought up the issue of trust, and trust is so essential for patients to feel good about their medical care. And I can imagine, you're a medical student seeing a patient for the first time, so you don't have a trust relationship with that patient, and the patient comes in maybe trusting ChatGPT more than you.
Very valid. No, I mean, I get that a lot, surprisingly. Sometimes like you're like, oh, I don't want to see the medical student, because we always give the patient an option, right? Like,
Sure.
it's their time, whether it's a clinic visit. But yeah, those patients, I think it's perfectly reasonable. If I heard a second year medical student was going to be part of my care team taking that history, I would be maybe a little bit concerned too. Like, are they asking all the right questions? Are they relaying that information back to their attending physician correctly? So I think a lot of it is, at least from a medical student perspective, is framing it so the patient understands that this is a learning opportunity for the students. And something I do a lot is tell them, like, hey, like, at the end of the day, there is someone double checking all my work.
Yeah.
But for those that come in with a list, I sometimes sit down with them and we'll have a discussion, honestly. But like, I don't think you have meningitis, because you're not having a fever. Some of the physical exam maneuvers we did were also negative, so I don't think you have anything too worried about that. You know, so I think it's having that very candid conversation with the patient that helps build that initial trust. Telling them, like,
it's impressive to hear how even keeled you are about this. I think, of course, and you're being very humble, saying, well, as a second year medical student, of course, someone might not, have complete trust. But I think that we will be entering into a world where no doctor is going to be, no matter how experienced or how skilled, is going to be immune from this issue. So we're starting to run toward the end of our time together, and I like to end with one or two more provocative questions. And so let me start with this one. Undoubtedly, I mean, you're close enough to tech and digital stuff, digital health, that you're undoubtedly familiar with famous predictions, by Turing and Nobel laureates, that someday certain medical specialties, most notably radiology, would be completely supplanted by machines. And more recently, there have been predictions by others, like Elon Musk, that maybe even some types of surgery would be replaced by machines. What do you think? Do you have an opinion?
I think replace is a strong term, right?
Yeah.
To say that doctors are completely obsolete, I think is unlikely. If anything, I think there might be a shift maybe in what it means to be a doctor, right? Undoubtedly, maybe the demand of radiologists are going to go down because maybe more of the simple things can be truly be automated, right? And you just have a supervising radiologist whose output is maybe 10 times as maybe 10 single radiologists, right? So I definitely see a future where the demand of certain specialties might go down. And I think when I talk about a shift of what it means to be a physician, maybe it's not so much diagnostic anymore, right? If these models get so good at like just taking in large amounts of information, but maybe it pivots to being really good at understanding the limitations of these models and knowing when to intervene is what it means to be the kind of the next generation of physicians. I think in terms of surgery, yeah, I think it's a concern, but maybe not in the next 50 years. Like those Da Vinci robots are great. I think out of Mayo Clinic, they were demoing some videos of these robots leveraging computer vision to like close portholes, like laparoscopic scars. And that's something I do in the OR, right? And we're at the same level at this point. So at that point, maybe. But I think robotics still has to address the understanding of like, what if something goes wrong, right? Who's responsible? And I don't see a future where a robot is able to react to these, dangerous situations when maybe something goes wrong. You still have to have a surgeon on board to kind of take over. So in that regard, that's kind of where I see maybe the future going.
So last question, when you are thinking about the division of time, one of the themes that we've seen in the previous guests is more and more doctors are doing more technology work, like writing code and so on. And more technologists are thinking deeply and getting educated in clinical and preclinical work. So for you, let's look ahead 10 years. What do you see your division of labor to be? Or, what would you tell your mom then about how you spend a typical day?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, technology is something I definitely want to be involved in my line of work, whether it's, AI work, whether it's improving quality of healthcare through technology. My perfect division would be maybe still being able to see patients, but also balancing some maybe more of these higher level kind of larger projects. But I think having that division would be something nice.
Yeah, well, I think you would be great just from the little bit I know about you. And Daniel, it's been really great chatting with you. I wish you the best of luck, with your upcoming exams and getting past this year 2 of your medical studies. And perhaps someday I'll be your patient.
Thank you so much.
One of the lucky things about my job is that I pretty regularly get to talk to students at all levels, spanning high school to graduate school. And when I get to talk, especially to med students, I'm always impressed with their intelligence, just how serious they are, and their high energy levels. Daniel is absolutely a perfect example of all that. Now,
It comes across as trite to say that the older generation is less adept at technology adoption than younger people. But actually, there probably is a lot of truth to that. And in the conversation with Daniel, I think he was actually being pretty diplomatic, but also clear that he and his fellow med students don't necessarily expect the professors in their med school to understand AI as well as they do. There's no doubt in my mind that medical education will have to evolve a lot to help prepare doctors and nurses for an AI future. But where will this evolution come from? As I reflect on my conversations with Morgan and Daniel, I start to think that it's most likely to come from the students themselves. And when you meet people like Morgan and Daniel, it's impossible to not be incredibly optimistic about the next generation of clinicians. Another big thank you to Morgan and Daniel for taking time to share their experiences with us. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. We have just a couple of episodes left, one on AI's impact on the operation of public health departments and healthcare systems, and another co-author roundtable. We hope you'll continue to tune in. Until next time.